Lab 257 Part 07 by Michael C. Carroll. The Disturbing Story of the Government's Secret. Part 2. The Safest Lab in the World. 4. Genesis. The hearings. As their reasonable public notice given, the USDA placed ads in the newspapers 1 week before the Plum Island hearings. Despite the short notice, 1,544 people objected through 16 petitions, written statements, and telegrams. Recorded opinions ran 3-1 against the laboratory. An examination of the USDA's internal files reveals very few supported the plan. The 5 local dairies urged all civic-minded citizens to fight against the menace to our community interest. The Greenport Oyster Growers Protective Association said the pollution from its sewage would tarnish the clarity and wholesomeness of the oyster beds. The Long Island Association, an esteemed body of business leaders, denounced the selection of Pest Island, in the midst of a recreational area during a post-war suburban boom, and the manner in which the hearings were handled, arbitrarily in conduct, with too short a time given for notice. "Positively outrageous," cried one resident in the local newspaper, who added a foreboding message. "Nature has a way of doing things that scientists do not or cannot anticipate. Who knows whether some pollution of the waters may occur, or whether the disease may be carried by flies or mosquitoes?" Another asked, "Why should the farmers, the fishermen, and the summer residents be placed in jeopardy for the sake of an industry unrelated to this area?" And yet another wrote, "The action of your department establishes a plague spot in our beautiful vacation land. After hoof and mouth disease, then what?" Secretary of Agriculture Brannan selected Plum Island on July 28, 1952. Views expressed were divided concerning the location, he said, but everyone recognized the need for such a facility somewhere. The USDA's fuzzy logic held that 99% of the population fully supported the lab, since only 1% vocally objected. The timing and manner of the public hearings point to a far different calculation. 99% of the people were not at all aware of the USDA's laboratory plan or their public hearings. Those who knew of the plan vehemently opposed their government, and the government won by stifling public opinion and by keeping the true purpose for Plum Island secret. In fact, the Army had awarded a secret construction bid to build a germ warfare lab on June 18, a full month before the selection hearings began. Worry locals' fears were justified, the hearings were rigged. Edward L. Bernays, the father of public relations, once defined his art as the engineering of public consent. On Plum Island, the USDA pulled off a PR masterpiece. IT will become a research center known throughout the world. A source of income, employment, and a point of pride in the community, the USDA heralded in its hearings pamphlet. Over time, Plum Island would indeed become known, though perhaps not for the reasons they had hoped for. The U.S. military had a special plan for Plum Island. In 1951, the Joint Chiefs of Staff determined that the destruction of the enemy's food supply by the use of anti-animal biological warfare agents would be strategic in its effect. In a long war of attrition and a front in Europe stabilized far to the east so as not to destroy the food of Allied Western Europe, it might then be to our definite advantage to initiate a vigorous anti-crop and anti-animal campaign and weaken the Soviet will to resist and encourage defection. The Soviets were doing a considerable amount of work in this area because they understood that famine provides a real threat. The time to act was now. Immediate action should be taken, the Joint Chiefs said, to procure an island tests. All types of hot agents could be tested with greater freedom and an animal laboratory could be established. This would also obviate the restriction imposed by law prohibiting work on certain animal diseases within the continental limits of the U.S. The military ordered Army veterinarian Colonel Donald L. Mace, Doc Shahan's partner in a 1948 virus eradication campaign in Mexico, to begin a cooperative project with the USDA and the Army on Plum Island, one that would be feasible and of potential mutual benefit. The USDA would be employed as a cover to sell the idea to the New York community. 5 top-secret projects were approved for the germ warfare island. 411-02051 411-02052 411-02053 411-02054 411-02055 Miscellaneous exotic diseases: Rift Valley fever, African swine fever, foot and mouth disease, rinderpest. Army surveyors landed on the deserted Plum Island in late 1951. They set up windsocks and fans and tested wind speed. They found prevailing winds from the southwest. That was good news, because if germs from their tests escaped off island, they would tend to blow east, into the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean, or south into Gardner's Bay, and dissipate, at least in theory. The surveyors also charted a regional population map, drawing radius circles around Plum Island at 10, 25, and 50-mile increments. Inside those circles were the Hamptons villages to the south, the Long Island Expressway, then under construction, to the west, and coastal Connecticut to the north. These would be the fallout zones if a biological accident occurred while the wind was blowing the wrong way. At Dr. Hagen's urging, the Army rehabilitated the old mine storage building but retained its fungible-sounding name, Building No. 257. By August 1954, over 100 large animals, horses, cattle, sheep, and swine, milled about in outdoor pens set up in the World War I-era artillery bunkers, and scientists used 1,000 mice and guinea pigs each month. The bunkers were fitted with corrals, metal railings, gratings, dip vats, walk-through sprayers, water bins, and feeding troughs. The sight of animals idling in cavernous concrete complexes that looked like ancient Mayan Indian ruins was a glimpse into a futuristic Stone Age. On small creatures and in culture dishes, work with hot viruses in Building No. 257, now simply called Lab 257, was performed in glove boxes, designed at Fort Detrick. Each steel-enclosed chamber had riveted glass windows and was fitted with thick black rubber gloves that reached deep inside for experiments. Activating Plum Island as a full-time germ warfare island presented a number of pressing problems, according to Army records. Foremost was the sheer difficulty of constructing the unique facility on an ocean-exposed island not connected to the mainland by bridge or tunnel. Further complicating the situation, the longshoremen ferrying the construction materials to the island went on strike, and the building laborers refused to cross their picket line. This significantly delayed the project. Recruitment of scientists from mainland Fort Detrick wasn't easy. I went up there for a job interview, remembers microbiologist William Patrick, and the weather was terrible, cold, foggy, and just horrible. I went over on that damn boat, got seasick, and said to myself, this is not for me. Patrick declined Colonel Mace's offer and stayed at Fort Detrick. The weather did me in, no question about it. To Dr. Al Webb, who occasionally came up from Fort Detrick to visit Doc Shahan, remembers the ferry. I remember thinking, this is a hell of a way to go to work. He saw firsthand why Patrick and others rejected invitations to Plum Island. If the wind was blowing up the Sound, or it was drizzling or snowing, you might think it was pretty grim, too. With all the delays, not much germ warfare research was accomplished. And the importance of that research was suddenly called into question. The Joint Chiefs found that a war with the USSR would best be fought with conventional and nuclear means, and biological warfare against humans, not against food animals. Destroying the food supply meant having to feed millions of starving Russians after winning a war. The Army was moving in too many biological warfare directions at once, and it was time to move anti-animal and anti-crop biological warfare to other appropriate agencies of the government. the Army asked the Secretary of Defense to order them off Plum Island. As Lab 257 neared completion in the spring of 1954, President Eisenhower approved an agreement between the Departments of Defense and Agriculture at a National Security Council meeting. Mace was ordered to pursue a minimal, yet forceful, research program at Fort Terry during the fiscal year 1954. The mission of Fort Terry, Plum Island, has been changed. From one which encompassed studies on various exotic animal diseases to determine both their offensive and defensive potentialities as biological warfare agents to one which pertains only to the defensive aspects of foot and mouth and rinderpest diseases. A declassified top-secret report stated, just before the turnover, that even though Department of the Army plans contemplated deactivation of Fort Terry, the Assistant Chief Chemical Officer for Biological Warfare at Camp Detrick will retain responsibilities in the anti-animal biological warfare field. Hardly did the Army up and leave, as the USDA presently maintains. As time wore on, it became easier for the USDA to repeat the mantra that it had nothing to do with the Army when both were on Plum Island, that there were two labs, that each agency did its own thing, that the USDA never so much as looked at the Army soldiers. Photographs excavated from the National Archives belie those assertions. Penned on the reverse of a curled-up black and white photograph is the notation Lab. Building. 257. February 2, 1954 is stamped in the lower left-hand corner. Standing at a bench the size of a dining room table, under the fluorescent light fixtures in a windowless, tiled room, are four men in starched white lab coats. They are crowded around a tall, boyish-looking man who is turning on a cylindrical heater, upon which sits a large flask containing a clear liquid. The man at the end of the table is leaning over, watching in earnest, with his arm stretched out on the lab bench, clutching an unlit pipe backward. The notes on the back of the snapshot continue, left to right, Lieutenant Colonel Donnell Mace, Dr. Owen Fellows, Dr. J.J. Callis, Dr. H.L. Bachrook and Dr. M.S. Shahan. The first two scientists were Army, and the other three were USDA. An Army officer on Plum Island at that time remembers the scene as typical of many demonstrations held in Lab 257. Often, he says, Dr. Fothergill, Fort Detrick's scientific director, would fly up and see what we were doing and how we were doing it, from technical to safety measures. Many of those exotic agents were a real tricky thing up there on Long Island. Two more dust-caked photographs preserved in the National Archives each picture a man seated alone at a metal office desk, with a pen held in his right hand, peering into the camera lens. Behind each man's right is the same three-shelf, glass-enclosed bookcase. Above it, a framed picture of bulls charging across an open swath of country. Behind each man's left shoulder is the same photograph of La Comisión Mexicana Americana para la Erradicación de la Fiebre Aftosa, the 1948 Mexico virus campaign. On the desk is an inbox tray, a stamp, and a quill pen cup. Colonel Donald L. Mace is in one of the photos, and the USDA's Dr. Maurice S. Doc Shahan is in the other. There are no other differences that distinguish the photos, shot in the exact same setting, dated the exact same day and same year. Clearly there was a USDA-Army relationship. Retired Major Luke H. West, an Alabaman inducted at Fort McClellan in 1941, was the Fort Terry top-secret control and security officer on Plum Island. Major West devised a scheme of color-coded security cards to enter the lab compound and conducted armed patrols of the compound and island perimeters. Although only a single laboratory report describing USDA's work for the Chemical Corps is publicly available, Major West remembers at least 25 to 50 research reports coming across his desk before they were mimeographed for Colonel Mace and sent down to Fort Detrick. West wouldn't elaborate on the contents of those reports. Did the Army's departure from Plum Island change anything? The Army may have shipped its files back to Fort Detrick, but Colonel Mace left something of infinite value behind: the germs. The defensive germ research performed by the men from agriculture would be extrapolated by standardizing the virus into a powder and placing it in Air Force cluster bombs. It didn't matter that the USDA told the public its research was only defensive, it was of dual use anyway. The USDA took beneficial control over the Army freezers, the 134 strains of 14 viruses, and did whatever it pleased with them. With the arsenal left behind, research continued unchecked. Plum Island was now far less safe. Major West and his Army soldiers no longer patrolled the island with military weaponry. As the Army went, so too went its scientific expertise, its regimen, and its deep pockets of financial resources. Now, Plum Island was a USDA site, and it would have to compete with Farm Belt states and their powerful lobbies in Congress over a limited pot of agriculture funds. Unlike military installations that enjoyed the backing of enthusiastic congressmen and senators, Plum Island would have little support from elected officials, most of whom still chafed over the harsh maneuvers employed to establish the laboratory in their midst. The USDA had control now, running not one, but two high-hazard biological laboratories on Plum Island. This was the same USDA whose very competence Congress previously questioned. Only time would tell whether the veterinarians could handle such great responsibility on their own. The first microbiology work on exotic viruses at Plum Island was performed by USDA men hired by the animal branch of the U.S. Biological Warfare Program. Plum Island's first lab experiment was also another first, its first lab accident. On July 21, 1954, 3 weeks after the Army transferred the island to the USDA, an angry cow coughed a glob of mucus into the unprotected face of a lab worker, known as FW. The previous day, FW had injected the cow's tongue with the New Jersey strain of highly contagious vesicular stomatitis virus, a germ probably enhanced by Eric Traub during his days working with the USDA. FW went home early and climbed into bed, ill with acute flu-like symptoms and chills. By 7 p.m., FW's temperature had spiked to 102 degrees, yellow lesions appeared on his sore throat. He plummeted into malaise and depression. The signs were clear: FW had contracted the animal virus. Hearing the news, FW's Plum Island colleagues saw a window of opportunity. They placed a call to FW's wife, who happened to be a registered nurse, in the name of science. Before FW took a heavy dose of terramycin, prescribed by the family physician, they asked his wife to collect blood and saliva, and swab the back of his throat with a Q-tip. She complied. The samples were stowed in her refrigerator and later ferried to Plum Island. Assistant Director Dr. Jerry Callis took FW's blood samples, spun them down in an ultracentrifuge, and stored the human serum in a flame-sealed glass ampule for future use. Then the man's virus-rich blood cells were injected into chicken eggs. This killed the embryos, drowning them in their own blood. The new FW strain was passed through 4 successive chicken egg embryos and then isolated again. Antibiotics were found to have no medicinal effect. The first published research abstract of the Animal Disease Laboratory carries an incongruous title: The Isolation of Virus from the Blood of Man. The report dryly notes, the infection contracted by FW occurred in a newly constructed laboratory. Past experience in other laboratories has shown the dangers associated with infectious materials inhaled or deposited accidentally in the eyes or nasal passages. There is no mention in the report of a safety violation or, more important, the need for revised safety procedures to prevent the human infection that sickened FW. But the USDA scientists had stumbled upon vesicular stomatitis as a promising incapacitating germ weapon. The Army was pleased with the USDA's inadvertent human field testing. With a troublesome test run under its belt, Plum Island was ready to handle the real thing. For the first time, exotic animal germs would be unleashed on United States soil. In eerie silence, the two young scientists, Drs. Callis and Howard Bachrick, looked on with reverence as veteran USDA man Dr. George Cottrell slowly and carefully unlocked the virus vault, unstrapped the box, unscrewed the canister, and carefully uncorked the ampules of hot germs. No accidents this time. On with the work. In their mandarin-collared white lab coats, the lanky Callis and the stumpy, bespectacled Bachrick bent over the flasks, neatly lined up on the long lab bench, stirring and shaking the concoctions, holding test tubes up to the fluorescent light, scribbling observations and mathematical equations on their pads. Any changes in color, consistency, evaporation? All were signs of microbiological reaction. They took samples, streaked them on a slide, peered into the microscope, and fiddled with the focus knob. Blood serum samples of 27 calves, 7 cows, 10 bulls, and 38 steers were set out in dishes and then injected with brucellosis bacteria and foot and mouth disease virus to test immune actions and reactions. They had to be extra careful with the brucellosis, because it caused an ailment of fevers, sweating, weakness, headaches, malaise, anorexia, abdominal pain, constipation, rigors, enlargement of the spleen, and coughing, and lasted from 4 to 8 weeks. 4 wary after the FW incident, the scientists escaped harm by wiping down surfaces and glassware constantly with a generous helping of Rockwell's solution, a chemical that kills microbes on contact. The experiments yielded the type of results Doc Shahin and the Army could only have dreamed of. Lab 257 and Part 07 by Michael C. Carroll. The disturbing story of the government's secret,